Evangelicals have always been fascinated with end times theology, especially in America, going all the way back to the 1800s when Darbyism, which is called dispensationalism now, came to prominence. But then it escalated in the 20th century when the Scofield Study Bible was introduced in the early 1900s. And then in the 1970s, with everything going on in the world, and the fixation came in through books like The Late Great Planet Earth with Hal Lindsey and so many other authors capitalizing, Tim LaHaye, on this theme. I came to be fascinated with it in the early 1990s when I was training for ministry. I got really into end times prophecy, what gets called eschatology. And I even remember in 1994, when I was in college, I would come home. I had a VCR back then, and I would actually record off of the Christian Broadcasting Network. I would record these end times prophecy shows. And so I was into whether it was John Hagee or the Van Impe's and these preachers who would outline these verses in the Bible and line them up so that you read the Bible with one hand and the newspaper in the other. This sounds so old, VCRs and newspapers. But I was really, really into it, as many evangelicals were and still are. In fact, I got so into it and so good actually at explaining it. Like I had wall charts. You could buy wall charts that actually outlined the end. But my unique fascination was with Daniel chapter 9, the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And I was convinced that we were living in the final week. And that if you look at how that week is broken up in the prophecy, that you have a sacrifice, Christ's sacrifice at 3.5 weeks, right? And then there's this break, and I couldn't really explain why there was a 2,000-year gap, but that everything was fulfilled, and we were just waiting for this final revelation, right? And whether you call that the tribulation or the rapture, and everything that you're probably familiar with end times vocabulary. On a side note, I do feel the need to say that even when I was super into it, and lots of people who are still really into it, that when people like Harold Camping came out with like 94 reasons that Jesus is coming back in 94 or whatever that book was titled, and then it didn't happen, and then he had to recalibrate and said, oh, I had interpreted this verse wrong. Even people who are like really into it know that that's bunk, and then anybody who says that they actually know doesn't. So I just want to say that there is some nuance within evangelical eschatology. I did a teaching weekend one time where I walked people through all the prophecies of the Bible and Jesus and Revelation. And so I felt really good about how tight of a presentation this was. But I suffered for it because I sort of pressed so much into eschatology, into end times theology, that I actually popped out. I broke through and I popped out on the other side. And I had this weird realization after that teaching weekend of Bible prophecy that it didn't pass the so what test. It didn't really matter. It was like trying to convince people that the 6th edition of the Dungeons and Dragons rules were better than the 7th edition of D&D. It was like an argument that was so niche, so inside baseball, that it didn't have any relevance to the bigger picture. And it was very discouraging to me. I over-believed. But I've come a long way since then. It was probably 15 years ago. And in the last 15 years, I've come to read the Bible in a very different way. In fact, what even gets called prophecy, the thing is that that's not a Hebrew understanding of the prophet. So the best explanation I've ever heard for reading the parts of the Bible that some evangelicals view as future telling is that prophets don't tell the future so much as they tell the truth in interesting ways. And that there's sort of an element to the prophetic where you speak truth to power. And when I started reading the Bible through that lens, and back then I used to read through the Bible every year. I have, did it for probably 20 years and knew the scriptures really well. And to read them through that lens freed me up to see that it's not that history was all written like in a book ahead of time and we were just watching the chapters unfold, but that the prophetic imagination was a political critique or a spiritual critique, depending on how you want to classify those things. To imagine that the world could be a different way. It took the events of its time and place and told them in this apocalyptic way with these fantastic creatures and dragons and women with 12 stars and all this stuff. And that was an apocalyptic because it was being written by an oppressed community who wasn't free to say things like, down with Rome. So they had to come up with creative ways to talk about how the city on seven hills, falls. It was resistance literature. And to read it in that lens transformed my understanding of what those scriptures were asking of that community, its first audience. And thus, the implication is how we were to read it now. One of the really sad parts for me is that when people think that those things that are written in the Bible, whether it's Daniel, Ezekiel, the Gospels, or even the book of Revelation, when they think that it is about the future and that the future is already established or preordained or destined, different language around that it actually crushes, it drains, it dries out the prophetic imagination that the scripture has the possibility of calling out of us, that it models for us an engagement of the systems and structures and institutions and injustices of our day, and that we lose that because we think it's already written. So we don't develop our own, we don't cultivate our own Christian imagination, prophetic, and even utilizing apocalyptic literature, because we already have that in place, and so we don't need to develop that. Well, in the last couple years, I have begun doing an interesting experiment that I wanted to tell you about, which is that when I talk to evangelicals who are in the news a lot, obviously because of not just their support of the 45th president and so many other things going on in our politic, many people think that actually the evangelical is very discredited right now, and that they've disqualified themselves through this type of thing from having validity, and that makes me very sad. So what I've found some success with is actually entering back into an evangelical understanding and walking with them through that as a sort of in a thought experiment by asking them, say, you probably think that this is the end times, and most do. And I'll say, and you probably think that the Bible prophesies certain events that can be counted on, and that's true too. And I say, so in my understanding of end times and eschatology, that at the end there is an antichrist figure, who's a double-tongued, fork-tongued liar, makes grandiose, gross claims, blasphemes, all sorts of stuff. But that character leads the people of God astray, the chosen, the elected. It leads the people of God astray. Am I right? Yeah. So that's called the apostasy. So if you think this is the end times, there has to be an apostasy, like a group that falls away from true belief. If this is the end times, who do you think that group might be right now? What do you think the apostasy is? And almost without exception, they will admit, if this is the end times and if there is an apostasy, it is probably the evangelicals. And that's an interesting way into a conversation about loyalties and priorities and selling out for political power and all the stuff that is sort of anticipated in evangelical eschatology. I just think it's really ironic that their fascination with the end times might end up doubling back on them and being their undoing at some level. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts, because for me, I'm not asking them to come into, say, my postmodern interpretation of scripture as literature. I'm not even asking them to consider the preterist view that everything that Jesus prophesied, and Daniel specifically, was fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and that Revelation was about the first century. I'm not even asking them to consider the preterist perspective. I'm entering into their way of understanding the scriptures and interpreting them, and asking, if this leads to that, what do you think this is? And it's been a really interesting experiment, and actually quite fruitful, to open up the conversation about what it means to be faithful during these troubling times.